それでは、お時間、少しちょっと会場の関係で5分後倒しになりましたが、お時間になりましたので始めさせていただきます。本日は、大変お忙しい中ですね、インパクト志向金融宣言の、イベントにお越しいただきまして、誠にありがとうございます。オンラインでも、もうすでに50名参加いただいてますし、会場もですね、皆さんお越しいただきましてありがとうございます。本日はですね、FCLT Global Focusing Capital on the Long Term というイニシアティブのアメリカで拠点で活動されているイニシアティブの、代表の方を CEO の方をお招きしてですね、イベントをさせていただくこととなりました。後ほどFCLT の組織の概要などご本人からご説明いただければと思いますが、非常にですね、アメリカ、ヨーロッパを中心に、特に非常に大きな金融機関さんですね、年金基金ですとか、大きなアセットマネージャーさんを巻き込んで、非常に大きな活動をされている団体になります。で、インパクト投資をさらにより大きな概念ですね、そのロングタームキャピタリズムを実現するために、実務家の方々、アセットオーナー、アセットマネージャー、で集まりながらどういうふうに実務的にそういったトランジションをしていくかっていうところをグローバルで訴えて活動されている、非常に尊敬できる、活動されている団体さんになります。で、本日のアジェンダ、時間割なんですけれども、最初ですね、サラ・ウィリアムソン CEO から、FCLT さんの団体について簡単にご説明いただきまして、15分、20分ほどでご説明いただきまして、ちょっとそのタイミングでよろしければ一旦質問ですとか Q&A をいただきまして、10分ほどお話ししました後、その次にですね、グレートグリーンというテーマで、実際にプライベートエクイティファンドですとかアセットマネージャーによるアセットをどう脱炭素化していくかっていうような実務的な取り組みですとかオポチュニティについてご紹介していただくことを考えております。そちらのプレゼンテーションも20分ほどさせていただいて、最後またですね、その後、最大30分ほど Q&A を取りまして、ネットワーキングというふうにできればと思っております。ですので、よろしければ会場の方もですね、オンラインの方もぜひ積極的にご質問いただければと思いますし、オンラインの方はチャットボックスでもご質問いただければと思いますので、ぜひよろしくお願いいたします。はい。では、So without further ado, let's get started the main part of today's session. So I will hand over to Sarah Williamson, CEO of Financial Focusing Capital on the Long Term. So over to you, Sarah.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for organizing this event, and thank you so much for having me here, both the people in the room and the people on the screen. So what we thought we would do today is spend just a few minutes telling you a little bit about FCLT Global, who we are, what our mission is, what we're trying to do, as well as some of the publications we've recently done, and then dive a little deeper into a couple of pieces of research. So I would welcome questions as we go along, and I'll ask Masa, you'll do the slides for me? Yes? Yeah, okay, let's just go to the first one then. Let me start with FCLT Global and who we are. So we are a nonprofit research organization with a very clear mission, which is to focus capital on the long term, to mobilize companies and investors, to create long-term value. So we were founded a few years after the global financial crisis, when a number of business leaders realized that the short-term nature of markets was causing all sorts of difficulties. So today we're supported by leading companies and investors around the world who help us develop research and practical tools that drive long-term value creation. And so we believe this conversation is particularly timely for Japan because, of course, this is a country with a rich tradition of long-term thinking and multi-generational thinking, but also at a time when much more overseas capital is flowing into the market, perhaps changing some of the traditions here. So in terms of quick history of our organization, in 2011, Dominic Barton, who at the time was the global managing partner of McKinsey & Company, wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review entitled Capitalism for the Long Term. And it really pointed out the challenges of the quarterly cycle, the quarterly capitalism cycle, narrowly focused on short-term shareholder return. But then in a few years later, 2014, Mark Wiseman, who at the time ran CPP Investments, the Canada Pension Plan, worked with Dom and wrote another piece called Focusing Capital on the Long Term, which pointed out that a big part of the challenge for companies that want to be long-term is the short-term nature of their investors. So it's not just the companies, it's also the investors, and that working at the intersection between the companies and investors is critical to really driving that long-term focus. So in 2016, CPP, McKinsey, BlackRock, Dow, and Tata together founded FCLT Global, and I started as our founding CEO at that time. So this group of leading institutional investors and companies recognized that taking the longer term view will both help them perform better and also better serve savers and communities. So today, as I said, we're supported by a diverse membership of the world's leading companies and investors who are committed to long-term value creation. And our members represent multiple sectors and geographies, all united by this commitment to long-term thinking. So major institutional investors include asset owners such as the Canada Pension Plan or APG in the Netherlands or CalSTRS in California, sovereign wealth funds like GIC and Temasek in Singapore, Norges in Norway, asset managers that are publicly facing like BlackRock, State Street, and so on, and then many of the world's largest private equity managers. And then we also have many global corporations, people like BP, Dow, Tata, Unilever, and JSR actually here in Tokyo. As well as most of the large service providers and the accounting firms. So this community represents trillions of dollars in assets under management and millions of employees around the world, all united by this belief that long-term thinking creates superior outcomes for companies, for investors, and for society. And we're actively engaging with companies here in Japan and investors here who share this vision. We see tremendous opportunity to learn from Japan and the organization's historical commitments to long-term stakeholder relationships and building a more modern and inclusive brand of capitalism. And we share the belief that financial institutions should actively address social and environmental issues while understanding that impact holistically. So the research I'll share with you today demonstrates how long-term thinking creates both financial returns and positive real-world outcomes. We believe very strongly that sustainability and financial performance are not opposing forces. They are aligned over a long enough period of time. So with that introduction, maybe let me pause for a minute and see if there are questions from our moderator or from others.
Sure. Yeah. ちょっとじゃあ、最初ですので、私簡単に、翻訳させていただければと思います。FCLT はですね、2013年に団体としては始まったんですが、その数年前からですね、活動の趣旨となるような、ソートリーダーシップが、 立ち上げメンバーの組織からされてきたということでした。で、例えばマッキンゼーのパートナーの方ですとか、CPP、カナディアンペンションプランですかね、非常に大きなアセットオーナーの方々からですね、このロングタームでファイナンスを考えることの重要性っていうところをいろいろな外リーダーがあったと。逆に言うとショートタームミニズムによっていろいろな問題が引き起こされているっていう問題提起もあったということで、特にこのファイナンシャルクライシスの教訓を生かした部分もあられたということなんですけれども、それをもとに2013年にCPP さんとマッキンゼーさんとブラックロックとタタさんという4つの巨大な企業によって誕生しまして、サラさんはその時からのファウンディング CEO ということでずっとやられてきたというところ、ということです。で、その後会員もすごく広がりまして、こちら今画面投影されているようなグローバルの一流、企業、ファイナンシャルインスティテューションズですとか、アセットオーナーさんですとか、コンサルティングファーム、企業さんもいらっしゃいますが、そういった方々が賛同して活動してきているということでございます。で、いろんなちょっとご本人の説明なかったですけれども、いろいろな相当リーダーシップのパブリケーションですとかレポートを出されてまして、そのうちの一つ、この後ご紹介いただくんですけれども、実務家が集まってやられていることですね、非常にプラクティカルな、いろいろな相当リーダーシップをされているというところでした。で、その活動の骨子といいますか、趣旨としましては、ただそのロングタームがいいっていうことだけではなくてですね、ロングタームをすることによって、より良いアウトカム、長期のファイナンシャルリターンも獲得できるっていう、考え方にのっとってですね、活動されてまして、それはそのステークホルダーを巻き込んでですね、一緒にそういうのを作っていくっていう前提で、というところですけれども、そういった考えにのっとっているような外リーダーシップをされているというところでございます。一度ここでもしですねFCLT さんの活動ですとか、に対して、ご質問ですとか何かコメントあられましたらぜひ、ピックアップさせていただいていただければと思いますけれども、どなたか何かございますでしょうか。もしちょっと私が最初に一つだけ質問させていただいて、その間にもし何かありましたらチャットボックスでも構いませんので入れていただければと思います。So, I just did a quick interpretation, then introduced what you have been doing, FCLT has been doing, and then also moving on to the quick Q&A session right now. But so my first question to you about the activities of FCLT is so it's been 12 years since FCLT has launched. Then I have been seeing, FCLT has been leading a lot of discussions in Davos and World Economic Forum and, everywhere in the world. And I am personally very impressed and interested in this activity, particularly because this is a group of actual practitioners doing actual investment. Then with that kind of nature, I think FCLT has been doing a lot of thought leadership with very practical manner. So with this kind of concept, in the last 12 years, what kind of reports or guidances or thought leadership has been made by FCLT? And is it mostly by report or mostly by roundtable discussions? What are the actual practical activities led by FCLT in the last 12 years?
Yes. So we really of three legs of the stool of the strategy, if you will. The first is the community, so some of the members we have and convening those members. So I'll just give you an example, which is every year we convene at the most senior level, the CEOs of our members, once in Asia, once in Europe, and once in the US. So next week, we will be convening our members in Singapore. And so that will be a discussion, a roundtable discussion around a particular topic. This time, this is on innovation and how are we funding long-term innovation. So one leg of the stool is these convenings. So we'll do one in Singapore next week. We'll do one alongside Davos in January. And then we have our own summit in New York in February. And so the idea of these convenings is to have a important and challenging topic, something that we're trying to figure out the answer to, and have a kickoff about it, but then really have a discussion among very senior people to try to have some new insights or new thought leadership or different ways of doing things. And when we have perhaps an investor from one country talking to a corporate leader from another country, they see things differently. And so that is sometimes when it comes about. So that's one leg of the stool, is the convening. The second, in no particular order, is the research itself. So the way that we do our research is we have a research team, and our team will think about what the most important issues are to focus on, and then do the homework. What have the academics done? What have other people done? What is out there? What's been done so far? And then what we try to do is bring our members together, again, around a particular topic. So we have three streams of research that we tend to have groups formed around. The first is around governance and incentives. So we think that the real drivers of long-term value creation are governance. It's essentially impossible to have a long-term orientation with a short-term board. Incentives are critical, I believe. And so one stream is often about governance and incentives. The second is about engagement between companies and investors, because that interaction between the companies and the investors, whether they're private or public companies, whatever kind of companies they are, is really critical to the company's ability to execute. So the second is that stream. And then the third is around metrics and innovation, because the numbers matter. And what we measure does matter. So we have these three streams of research where we have a lead for each of those. There are particular topics that come up. And then, as I said, we do the homework. We bring our members together. And importantly, we don't ask our members to agree. So we don't ask our members to all say they're going to do the same thing, or all even agree what the right thing is. Because we have found that if you ask everybody to agree, there's not much you can actually agree on that's interesting. So we don't ask them to agree. Excuse me. So that's the second one, is the research. And then the third is trying to get the message out, trying to communicate broadly. And as you can tell, I've been talking too much, so I'm starting to lose my voice. But trying to get the message out about what is why it's so important to have long-term focus in the capital markets. And one way we've just been doing this, we have just published this book, which we have a copy of here that anyone who's in the room can look at, or we can look at online, which is called The CEO's Guide to the Investment Galaxy. And this is the kind of publication, this is our first book, but the kind of publication that we do try to do in terms of both thought leadership, but also building communication across the ecosystem. So the idea of this book, for example, is one thing that we've often found is that corporate leaders don't understand all the different types of investors that are out there. And why should they? A corporate leader is maybe, an engineer or a leader of people, or they've been brought up doing something else. And that at some point in their career, somebody says, well, now you need to talk to the investors. And there are index funds and there are active funds and there are asset owners and there are asset managers and there are the regulators and there are exchanges and all of these things. So this book is written very much in the style. If you remember the book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where they fly around and land on planets and meet creatures, this is written in the same sort of light style, not technical, but about what are the time frames and what are the personalities, what are the characters of these various different types of investors. And the goal of that is to help corporate leaders understand where their capital is coming from and how to then interact with those investors in order to build real value. So in terms of, what are we trying to do? It's build that community, do the research, and then get the word out.
Thank you. I'm gonna interpret again, so please take some water to, yeah. ですね、ちょっとこちらもFCLT さんのかなり重要な前提のお話ですので、訳させていただければと思いますけれども、どういった特にですね、この活動されてきたかっていうお話をさらに深掘りしてお伺いしたところ、主に3つ、活動をされてまして、1つ目がコミュニティ、エンゲージメントをされているということで、主にヨーロッパ、北米、アジアで、そのところどころの会員さんのエグゼクティブリーダークラスの方々をお招きして、ラウンドテーブルディスカッションを都度開催しているということでした。で、最近のトピックはロングタームかけるイノベーションということで、どういうふうにそれを促進していくかっていうところをその地域のリーダーの方々と意見交換をされているというところがありますと。で、そこのコミュニティのディスカッションで上がったトピックをもとに、2つ目の活動としてはリサーチの活動がありまして、をされているというところでした。で、リサーチの中でもですね、3つ柱がありまして、1つ目が、そのガバナンスとインセンティブをどういうふうにすることで、このロングタームなアプローチを実際にドライブするかっていうところをリサーチされるというところですとか、2つ目がエンゲージメントでして、これは会社さんとインベスターの間でどういったエンゲージメントをすることでこのロングタームをドライブできるかっていうところで、3つ目がメトリックスですね。これはESG メトリックスとかいろいろなメトリックスの方法がありますけれども、どういうメトリックスを取ることで会社のロングタームな考えを維持発展ドライブできるかっていうことを研究されてパブリッシュされるということでございました。で、3つ目のタイプの活動としては、コミュニケートということで、そのコミュニティで話されたディスカッション内容ですとかリサーチの内容をいろいろな形でパブリッシュされて、相当リーダーシップされているということで、一つ紹介としてこの最近、出された本のご紹介がございました。で、ちょっとこれは日本で手に入るかわからないんですけれども、what was the name of the book?
It's called The CEO's Guide to the Investment Galaxy.
CEO's Guide to Investment. I'm not sure if it's available in Japan, but
well, I know it's on Amazon in many parts of the world. There's an audio book that is supposed to be out next week,
cool.
And an ebook. So I don't know if the paper one is. We should look.
Yeah. オーディオブックではもうすぐ手に入るみたいですので、ぜひ聞かれればと思いますけど、内容としてはその会社のリーダーが、インベスターに多くのそのCEO の方ですとかが初めてCEO になられて初めて投資家に接することが多いということで、投資家さんによっては本当にいろんなタイプの投資家さんがいるので、どういった投資家さんがどういうプレファレンスですとかタイムフレーム、パーソナリティとかを持たれてやってるかっていうことを紹介する本ということでした。はい。では一旦ちょっと今のところの訳画を。
マサさん、オンラインで一つ熊澤さんから。
ありがとうございます。
There is one question from Mr. Kumazawa. From your perspective, Do you think Japanese companies are capable of long-term value creation? And on the other hand, how should we understand the fact that Japan has been experiencing long-term economic stagnation? What systemic elements are missing for Japanese companies to achieve long-term value creation?
So I think that if we look at some of the companies we see active in Japan, they clearly have created value over long periods of time. So think of some of the companies that you all know. They've created value again and again in different fields, in different industries. So I don't think there's any question that Japanese companies can create value over long periods of time. I think that there are some distinct features of the Japanese capital market that are different. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're worse, but they're different than other parts of the world. And perhaps, and I would hate to opine on something I'm not an expert on, but I'll point out some of the differences and you all can decide if those are good or bad. So one is the importance of banks in the management and the lending to companies. It's unusual. The role of banks here is much larger than in most developed countries. And it's more common here that banks might have a representative on a board or might be the primary source of debt capital rather than the bond market or some other external source. And I think that there are some advantages to that, but banks by their nature, their job is to limit downside more than it is to push for upside. And so I think that's a constraint in some ways. And I think that I think that's one thing that's somewhat just, again, different about the structure here. Another thing that is somewhat different is that boards here, relative again to many countries in the world, are much more operational. They tend to meet more often. Boards in most countries meet quarterly, so they're not looking at things on a monthly basis. They're not looking at things quite as often. And they tend to be people who are trying to provide some assistance to the company, but they're not running the company. So the shorthand for what boards do in most places in the world is oversight, insight, and foresight. They need to oversee the management team, make sure they're doing their jobs. They need to have some insight, hopefully, and to connect the dots between different industries or bring a perspective from somewhere else. And they need to have foresight. They need to help the company think about what might come next. And because they're not running the company every day, it's easier for them to sort of step back. My understanding of Japanese boards is that they're more hands-on than most boards around the world. So I would just point out those two differences as things that are characteristics of companies here that are different. Whether those are hindrances, I don't know. I'll let you all decide.
Thank you so much. 熊澤さん、大丈夫でしょうか。はい、大丈夫だと思います。
ありがとうございます。じゃあ、ちょっと今のところも翻訳した方が、時間の関係大丈夫ですかね、今のところは。はい。皆さん、うなずいてる方が多かったので、すいません。次に行かせていただきます。まずは、今のこのセッションのタイミングで他に質問は、ございませんかね。わかりました。ちょっと、私、一つだけ、興味本位での質問を最後させていただきます。FCLT さんのご紹介も兼ねての質問になりますが、so one last question from my side about FCLT and your activity. So this is just out of curiosity, but I looked at the list of attendees for your Davos session. Then I was very impressed. There are many high-level executives from very large, influential organizations attending to your roundtable in Davos. And I was wondering what really made them to join your roundtable? Is it because of the this is launched by really influential people like CPP, McKinsey, BlackRock, Tata, but I think that's not only the thing, but also like there's a lot of benefits they felt, and that's why that made them to join. But would you also share what kind of people joined, and also like what really made people keep being involved to your activity?
Well, thank you for that. Particularly at the Davos event, well, at all of our events, we try to have a topic that is somewhat controversial. Our internal watchword is anything but boring. So we like to have something where people are going to disagree. And again, they're coming from different countries, they're coming from different backgrounds. So hopefully what happens is they have a really interesting and important conversation, and they learn something that is that they can take back to their jobs, their day jobs. So I'll just give you one example from the Davos meeting last year. Our topic was, and you have to remember when this was literally the day that Trump was going to be inaugurated in the United States. And the narrative in the world was all about American exceptionalism, and that the best technology, et cetera, et cetera. No, the stock market was way up. Nobody could compete, and the Europeans were nowhere. So the controversial topic we had was, can Europe attract global capital? And then the question is, well, how? And so there are some people that might frankly be slightly offended by that question, like, can they even attract capital? But we're trying to have a lively discussion. And there are very different opinions. And so as we said, there are people in that room who are investing a lot of money, and they're deciding, do they want to put it in Japan or the US or Europe or somewhere else? And so there's a real conversation about, I'm putting money in Europe, or I'm, billions of dollars, or I'm not because of this. And I'm moving it there. Then we had somebody there who was deciding where to put a big factory and where they're going to put it in Europe or somewhere else. So I think the reason these things work is that we have a community that is, all these conversations are off the record. There are no talking points, but that people are prepared to share what they're challenged by, and in that sort of environment with people who have a different perspective because they come from a different place.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And it was attended by a lot of those firms' CEO, right? So I wish I can make it, but it must have been very insightful discussion. So let's move on to the next agenda, which is about introducing one of your researches, Gray to Green research. So I will hand it over to you again, then we'll move back to the slides. Yeah.
All right, can you just go to the next one, please? Okay. So this research is about work we've done on, which we've called Gray to Green, and how do we invest in a decarbonizing world. So we believe we are seeing fundamental reallocation of capital toward low carbon transitions. And this reallocation is not driven by altruism or even by regulatory mandates, but it reflects recognition that economic value increasingly concentrates in businesses and infrastructure that are positioned for long-term sustainability within a carbon-constrained future. So the scale of this transition is substantial, but the time frame is very unclear. And we see that this time frame dimension is critical for portfolio managers. We don't know exactly how climate change will unfold. We don't know exactly how transitions will occur. But capital deployment, as this group knows well, is happening today. So institutional investors that position themselves strategically today will capture those risk-adjusted returns over time. So those that don't pay attention to these issues will risk facing the real costs of extreme weather events or uninsurable assets or carbon pricing in some way that is hard to deal with. So we believe that an effective capital deployment strategy requires a precise understanding of where emissions originate and therefore where transformational capital can generate meaningful economic and environmental outcomes simultaneously. And the sectoral breakdown of that is instructive, which you see here. This distribution matters strategically because they're not marginal economic sectors. These are sectors that are foundational to the global economic functioning. They maintain existing infrastructure, capital requirements, established management structures. And so transforming them through patient capital combined with operational expertise can create sustained multi-cycle investment opportunities. One area of our research is defining this specific investment approach to transition, which we call gray to green investing. So gray to green investing means deploying capital into high carbon emitting sectors with the explicit objective of reducing emissions over time. So the distinction from other approaches is essential, and this carries substantial implications for how capital should function. So the way this differs fundamentally from many climate strategies, which are more divestment-oriented strategies. And those are strategies that simply transfer ownership of a gray, perhaps, asset from one institutional investor to another. So when a pension fund, for example, divests from carbon-intensive assets, and those assets are transferred to other investors with different motivations, the actual global emissions remain unchanged. So we, as a whole, may have accomplished capital reallocation, but we have not accomplished any decarbonization for the planet. And so that essential goal of reducing real-world emissions eludes us. So gray to green investing recognizes this straightforward economic reality that energy, transportation, steel, cement are fundamental to global economic systems, and we can't exclude these sectors from capital flows. And therefore, markets will not achieve transition through exclusion. Instead, transition occurs through the systematic transformation of existing assets, combining patient capital with operational expertise to improve environmental performance while capturing economic value embedded in that improvement. You want to stop? Should I stop there? Please. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That one. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Do you want to summarize that, or do you want me to keep going?
Maybe let's
keep going. Okay, fine.
And yeah.
Great. So one area that we've particularly focused on is private equity, and we think that broadly the private market investors possess distinctive structural characteristics to have leadership in this gray to green transition. First of all, private markets operate with a governance structure that enables deep engagement with portfolio companies. Rather than managing diffuse shareholder bases with competing objectives, private ownership creates concentrated accountability around specific performance objectives. This governance structure enables management teams to pursue transformation strategies requiring sustained focus and consistent capital support. Second, private markets operate with longer holding periods, essential for transformation. Longer holding periods create space for sustained operational improvement that is less feasible within public market shorter timeframes. And third, beyond structural characteristics, private markets increasingly combine financial expertise with deep domain knowledge. Successful gray to green investment requires understanding not generic financial analysis, but the operational realities of specific industries. So the private equity industry is raising substantial capital specifically oriented towards decarbonization strategies, and many funds explicitly include gray to green investment mandates. I can stop there and then we could talk about some of the approaches. Yeah? Yeah. Okay. All right, I don't want to give you too long.
今回ご紹介しているプレゼンはですね、先ほどお話があっていろんなリサーチの一つなんですけれども、今回インパクト指向金宣言向けに特に実務者ファイナンスの実務者が多い団体ですので、よりプラクティカルなものということでこのトピックを選んでいただきましたと。でそれがこのグレーとグリーンなんですけれども、投資家のエンゲージメントを通じてどういうふうにこのグリーントランジションといいますか脱炭素、グリーンハウスガスの削減を進めていくかっていうことについてのリサーチのご紹介になってます。でよくある手法としてダイベストメントっていうのもありますけれども、やはりそれだけですと結局株主から違う株主に株が渡るだけでその実際の脱炭素の行動はあまり起きない、場合によってその株価が下がることによって間接的にっていうのはあるのかもしれないですけれども、実際の主体的なデカーボナイゼーション戦略ではないということで、特に注目して今回レポートとしてまとめているのはこのプライベートエクイティのアセットクラスを通じたデカーボナイゼーションのエンゲージメントというのを紹介していただく内容になっています。でプライベートエクイティ、特にバイアウトですとかベンチャーキャピタルでエンゲージメントをハンズオン多くするベンチャーキャピタルもいますので、そちらも含めてだと思うんですけれども、その性質として、ポートフォリオの会社に、エンゲージメントですね深くする傾向がありますし、保有期間もですね短期的なヘッジファンドですとか上場株投資家に比べるとロングタームですし、かつ多くのプライベートエクイティファンドがドメインエクスパティーズ、オペレーショナルな実務能力、知見を持っているので、実際にその業界、その投資先がどういうふうにオペレーションを改善することによって脱炭素化ができるかっていう知見も持っているということで、この投資後の保有期間を通じてデカーボナイゼーションする、傾向がよく見られているという紹介があります。はい。Okay.
So maybe we could talk on the next slide, I think, about some of the approaches people are taking to, so we talked about this a little bit, the private market advantages. Can we go to the one more, I believe? There we go. So the approaches, is it too small? I can see if you were looking. We can share if it's too small. So there are a number of approaches people are taking to decarbonization, and I'll just walk through what each one of these is. So we find that investors pursuing climate transition and sustainable valuation strategies employ one of several distinct strategic frameworks And understanding these approaches and sort of deciding which one somebody wants to do for themselves enables portfolio managers to select strategies aligned with their institutional objectives, risk tolerance, and investment timelines. So the first one we have listed there, we call the silent approach. And that essentially assumes away climate change in any serious way. So it assumes that future market conditions will likely mirror historical patterns. In other words, it'll be more similar to the future than it has been in the past. Under this framework, investors are making two primary assumptions. First, that extrapolating from past performance adequately illuminates future outcomes. And second, that they can discount potential future investment losses from climate change into their current valuations. In other words, it's not going to be that different. This approach requires minimal active management or portfolio restructuring, and it treats climate risk as a pricing adjustment rather than a fundamental system transformation. And so while this approach involves of lower costs and minimal complexity, it assumes that market pricing mechanisms will adequately reflect climate dynamics. So for investors with limited capacity to analyze climate transition dynamics, or for whom the regulatory environment creates pressure towards more passive approaches, this sort of silent strategy provides minimal controversy, but potentially limited protection against emerging climate-related costs. So that's the first one, just sort of business as usual. The second one we think of is principles-based. And the principles-based approach employs a values-based criteria to guide capital allocation decisions. So investors who pursue this strategy typically employ a combination of investing and philanthropy to address climate change, and they direct capital towards enterprises aligned with their institutional values, and maybe they support causes as well through more philanthropically dedicated programs. So a primary tool in this approach is divestment and exclusion, systematically removing or excluding specific companies or specific industries from investment portfolios. So those exclusions could be of fossil fuels or, in traditionally in other cases, tobacco, any sort of thing that people don't want to invest in. So this approach provides values-based positioning and supports specific social missions. However, as we talked about earlier, divestment-focused strategies accomplish capital reallocation without necessarily achieving real-world emissions reductions. So it depends what the goal is. So this approach suits institutions where values alignment with their own constituencies, with their own stakeholders, is paramount. The third is what we call an analytical approach. The analytical approach assumes that financial markets have not yet fully incorporated climate dynamics into pricing. And in this framework, investors actively search for pricing inefficiencies created by market misunderstanding or inability to price climate risks and opportunities. So two primary strategies here are reweighting, so overweighting assets that are believed to be underpriced for some reason and underweighting ones that are overpriced. And this approach requires sophisticated analytical capability to identify pricing disconnects between market consensus and underlying climate dynamics. So the success of this approach depends on the timing of market repricing. In other words, when the market actually starts to incorporate climate, and analytical accuracy regarding carbon price evolution, stranded assets, and so on. The other strategy, so that's a bit of trying to incorporate the future carbon pricing, for example, today. The other is seeking out breakthrough innovations. So thinking more in an options pricing mindset or venture capital mindset, recognizing that breakthrough technologies addressing critical climate change is may currently be mispriced, given their uncertainty, and there's a lot of uncertainty around their technological viability and their commercialization pathways. So this approach suits investors with sophisticated analytical capability and meaningful risk tolerance. They're going to make some bets about things that might pay off and might not. The fourth approach we outline here is what we call a catalyst approach. So this approach assumes that investors actually can drive transformation. So they're not just investing their own portfolio for themselves. They can actually drive transformation through direct engagement with portfolio companies or capital allocation. So they're really seeking a greener planet, not just a greener portfolio. So the two primary strategies here are investing in known solutions to try to scale. And so those are things like green infrastructure, regenerative agriculture, electrification, electric cars, carbon sequestration, things that we know work but are not scaled at this stage. So this approach focuses capital on enterprises that are already developing and deploying proven technologies that need to be scaled up. The second approach is more about influencing companies to change their transition pathways. So influencing companies that investors own to move from a high carbon to a low carbon intensity mindset. And they can do that through active ownership, systematic engagement. So rather than divesting from carbon intensive enterprises, engagement oriented investors maintain ownership positions while working systematically to shift portfolio company towards real world decarbonization by improving their existing enterprises rather than transferring ownership. So this engagement requires sustained commitment, sophisticated understanding of the industry, and meaningful influence over the portfolio companies in question. Institutional investors frequently employ combinations of these approaches within a diversified portfolio. And the specific approach selection reflects the institutional risk tolerance, analytical capacity, stakeholder expectations, investment timelines, and the regulatory environment. So the Grey to Green framework that we discussed earlier, deploying patient capital to transform high carbon assets into low carbon assets, most closely aligns with this catalyst approach that we list here last, emphasizing engagement in systematic transformation. I'm going to stop there.
Alright. ちょっとじゃあここまた重要な内容でしたので、ちょっとご説明させていただきつつ、もし皆さんの方でもご質問あればチャットでも構いませんし、後ほどQ&Aでも聞いていただければと思います。少しちょっとテクニカルな話でそういう話をしてくださいとお願いしたんで出てきたのかもしれないですけど、投資そのデカーボナイゼーションインベストメントアプローチに4つのタイプがあるという大きく分けですね。って話がありますと。で、まず一つ目はこれ逆にアプローチある意味しないっていうところに近いんですけれども、過去通常の投資をそのままに近いんですけれども、過去の投資から将来どういうことが起きるかっていうものをそのまま延長線上で予測して、その結果クライメットチェンジによってロスとかも起きる可能性があるものをそのまま認識して投資をするっていう一番ある意味何もしないトラディショナルというか投資のアプローチということですと、これは4つのアプローチのうちの一つなんていうんですかね、ある意味何もしないバージョンというのが一つ目として紹介されまして、二つ目がですね、先ほど言ったダイベストメントのような話です。で、この大きな投資会社ですとかバイオネットフィランソロピーでも用いられてますけれども、カーボンインテンシブなセクターからダイベストメントするという手法ですと。で、これは先ほどのお話の通り、実際にはリアルリダクション を別にもたらすわけではないということで、キャピタルリアロケーションするだけですので、非常にパッシブな、デカーボナイゼーションという意味では非常にパッシブな、アプローチだと言えますということでした。で、3つ目がアナリティカルアプローチということで、ここからある意味カーボン戦略、リダクション戦略を使いながらバイオネットアルファを作っていくですとか、カーボン、削減をより促進するってアプローチになっていくんですけれども、このアナリティカルアプローチの中でも2つありまして、1つ目のリウェイティングというものについては、基本的に、これ、上場株の場合よりイメージがつきやすいかもしれませんが、そのアセットですとかものによって、いろんなことが織り込まれて価格形成がされているわけですけれども、ものによってはまだそのカーボンの、気候変動ですとかの影響が、価格に織り込まれてない、もの、場合によってはネガティブな影響、ポジティブな影響あると思うんですけど、そういったものを分析によって導き出して、そこに投資をするというアプローチが1つ目でして、2つ目については、よりベンチャーキャピタルに近いんですけれども、織り込まれてないものの中でも、どちらかというとまだ発見されてないテクノロジー、実現化されてないテクノロジーに対して出資を行うことで、それが実現したときに、実際に、大きなデカーボナイゼーションインパクトを生むというアプローチの2つがありますと。で、どちらも非常に分析力が必要ですので、そういったことができる投資家に向いている手法ですというお話でしたと。で、4つ目の、カタリストアプローチというものがも2つタイプがありまして、1つ目はですね、これは、そうですね、このグリーン脱炭素を実現できるテクノロジーってことがもうある意味分かっているけれども、そのキャピタルの量などによって制限があってまだ実現できてないものについて投資をすることによってそれを促進させるアプローチというお話でしたと。で、例えばグリーンインフラストラクチャーですとか、リジェネラティブアグリカルチャーなど挙げられてますけれども、こういったものがありますと。で、カタリティクストアプローチの中で、その次、2つ目がですね、エンゲージメントアプローチということで、これは投資をしている会社に対して、その会社のオペレーション変革ですとか、ビジネスの方向性の変革を投資家としてエンゲージすることによって、よりローカーボンな事業体にしていく、っていうアプローチによって脱炭素化を主導していくっていう、方法ですということでした。はい。結構込み入ったお話ですので、もし後ほど何かご質問あればお願いいたします。
込み入ったというか。
Are there any questions about this framework or feedback on it? And we can talk about the other things we have are sort of what are some of the barriers? Why is this hard? But if there are any questions, we can take them before we continue with that if you like.
いや、もし何か今この時点で質問があれば取れればと思いますが、なければ一旦次に進みまして、最後また必要に応じて戻ってこられればと思います。はい。So,
Great. All right, can we go to the next slide then, please? So there are some barriers to implementing some of these things. So the first is the so in other words, why isn't capital flowing into greater green investments at scale right now? It's starting to, but why is it not big yet? So we think understanding these barriers is necessary for developing solutions. So the first one we think about is risk return requirements. So most investors in the world really need to meet their risk and return requirements. They can't have some sort of concessionary return. So that I think is the first and most important barrier to really understanding how these work. Excuse me. And can the general partners, do they have the deep knowledge required for successful transformation? excuse me, can they articulate credible transition pathways grounded in climate science rather than just aspirational claims? And what is the evidence that transformation strategies will actually generate competitive returns? So this challenge is genuine. Transitioning high carbon assets remains an evolving investment practice, and the research case for Grey to Green is still developing. So performance track records are limited, and limited partners must evaluate these new strategies with incomplete information and modest historical precedent. So extending holding periods creates a tension. Genuine transformation requires longer investment time horizons than traditional private equity models typically assume. And this extended timeline creates pressure on IRR. So the second issue is portfolio measurement conflicts. And this barrier emerges from climate commitments that many limited partners may have already established. So some pension funds and sovereign wealth funds around the world have made public pledges to reduce portfolio emissions intensity. And many have established 2030 reduction targets and made these commitments public, measurable, and reputationally significant. So there's a genuine tension in portfolio management where limited partners who are concerned about the carbon intensity of their portfolios worry about investing in something that's higher carbon, even if it's on that transformation path to lower carbon. So the next risk that we think a lot about are the measurement and measurement and reputational dimensions. Limited partners are increasingly demanding that general partners disclose greenhouse gas emissions associated with their investments. And the challenge is that greenhouse gas portfolio metrics, while superficially quite straightforward, are actually very complex, opaque, and fundamentally backward-looking. So current greenhouse gas accounting frameworks provide snapshots of current emissions, not insight into the transformation trajectory. They reveal where emissions exist today, not whether management is successfully implementing reduction. And disclosure typically occurs at the portfolio level, aggregating information and obscuring company-specific progress. So addressing these risks requires substantial additional effort, enhanced disclosure, proactive shareholder communication and other stakeholder communication, rigorous engagement documentation, and transparent progress reporting. These demands are legitimate from accountability perspectives, but they represent real transactions costs for the implementing institutions. So those are some of the barriers. What are some of the solutions? One is real clarity for limited partners regarding the strategic role Grey to Green investing is playing within their overall investment frameworks. So long-term limited partners have carefully considered why and how climate change should factor into their investment approach. They're substantially better positioned to make informed decisions about whether and how and to what extent they participate in Grey to Green strategies. And this clarity must extend through their institutional structures. Board directors and trustees must understand climate transition dynamics and implications for long-term portfolio performance. Chief investment officers must articulate how climate considerations integrate with fiduciary obligations. Investment teams require capacity to evaluate specific opportunities. So these effective governance structures supporting this clarity are really essential on the limited partner side. On the general partner side, they also need clarity. So they need clarity regarding how investment strategies will integrate competitive returns and decarbonization outcomes. So the general partner needs to be able to articulate the mechanics by which they expect to generate attractive returns through activities that also drive climate transition. So conversations need to address things around carbon pricing assumptions, what role the GP tends to play, and what kinds of high carbon companies and industries their funds will target, and the proportion of high carbon within a particular vehicle. The other thing is the importance of holding period is particularly important here as well. Extended periods are essential for genuine transformation, but directly impact return metrics. Is the general partner's anticipated holding period sufficient to achieve the identified objectives or not? So that clarity for the LPs and GPs is very, very important. We want to emphasize that on the solution side. The three other things we've got mentioned here are carve-outs. And what a carve-out means is when a limited partner has established a portfolio goal for carbon, then investing in a high carbon activity, which will be decarbonized, often means that they won't hit those metrics. So a way to solve that is to carve some portion out of the portfolio and have a transition carve out where assets that are explicitly more carbon intensive and being transitioned are placed in that carve out section. The next one we list here is asset level metrics. A lot of times carbon is measured, or emissions are measured at the portfolio level rather than an individual asset. And of course, if you think about the way portfolios work, what that means is if you add an asset to a portfolio, then the overall emissions will go up, even if every asset in that portfolio is declining. So we think thinking about those asset level metrics are really important. And the standard today is mostly looking at portfolio level metrics. And then the last thing which we really want to emphasize, I mentioned early on that we're big believers in incentives and incentive structures. So having innovative incentive structures that really can drive decarbonization is critical. Thoughtfully designed incentive structures build limited partner confidence that the general partners are pursuing both return and climate objectives in genuine integration. Such structures also reward general partners for innovative approaches, enabling joint success. So it's too common that a general partner could say they're raising money to decarbonize, but then not actually have an incentive for the decarbonization portion of that. So climate outcomes can be integrated across multiple incentive structure elements, such as the hurdle rate can require achievement of both financial and climate targets. A fund might establish a hurdle requiring both 8% returns and 50% emissions reduction, for example. This explicitly signals that both objectives are necessary for compensation to be paid. Carried interest structures can also employ step up and step down provisions, conditioning compensation on emissions achievement. So carried interest might be 25%, for example, if there's a 50% emissions reduction, but only 10% if there's no reduction. And this is the sort of direct financial incentive that drives GP behavior. Base fees can also reflect the importance of capacity building. There are funds that need an additional 25 basis points to have that capacity building to actually know how to decarbonize the assets. And then finally, catch-up provisions can require emissions targets to be achieved to trigger the catch-up compensation if the return hurdles are met. So we think that these incentive structures can really drive that behavior. And we note here that Ontario Teachers has been a leader in terms of implementing some of these sorts of structures in some of their funds. So let me stop there.
10年経った時に、このまま使えるかどうかっていう点検をやってくれますと。だけど、普通は
Okay, so before doing interpretation, I missed one point. So what was asset level metrics? How is it?
So an asset level metric, think about a portfolio that has, let's say 4 companies in it or 4 pieces of infrastructure, and you're trying to bring each one of the emissions down on each one of those, but then you buy an additional asset. And so of course the total portfolio emissions go up. Most investors are actually measuring portfolio emissions. So that would look bad, but if the assets were actually coming down, that would actually be good. If the asset level emissions were, so shifting from a portfolio level metric to an asset level metric
something like on average.
Or really looking at each one. I mean, it depends how many are in our portfolio, but yes. Yes, exactly.
Okay. じゃあちょっとこちらもかなり結構テクニカルなインプリケーションがありましたので、簡単に総括させていただければと思いますけれども、特に、VCP、アセットオーナーさん含めやられている方は、この脱炭素の取り組み結構大変だと思われている方多いと思うんですけれども、その解決策ですとか、そもそもどういうバリアがあるかっていうお話でして、まず左側のバリアとして、いくつか挙げられましたけれども、簡単に要約して申し上げますと、リスクリターンのところがそもそもの前提でアセットオーナーさんもアセットマネージャーさんも出資しているので、そことそのデカーボナイゼーションの結びつきの理解、を得ることがなんていうんですかね、追加の説明がかかったりコストがかかったりっていう話があったりですとか、実際に脱炭素の取り組み始めるとしたときに、そのメジャーメントですね、が非常にGP さんにも投資先にもコストがかかるということで、非常に複雑ですし、かといって簡単にすると非常に表面的になりますし、ということで、そこのディフィカリティなどもあるというのがバリアとして挙げられましたと。で、一方でそれに対してのソリューションとして今いろんな実務として挙げられているものの紹介があったんですけども、例えばまずそもそもLP さん GP さんともにその脱炭素化がフィデューシャリーデューティの観点からどう重要かですとか、リターンを生むためにどういう重要かっていうナラティブデータなどを用いてステークホルダーを事前にちゃんと説明をしたりコンセンサスビルディングをするっていうことをしてる方々が非常に多いということが紹介されたりですとか、その他の手法としてカーブアウトという話がありまして、これ結構バイアウトのエンゲージ手法の方がピンとくるかもしれないですけれども、投資先の事業の中でカーボンインテンシティが高い事業を場合によってはカーブアウトして、もちろんそれで採算が上がるっていうこともついてだと思うんですけれども、そういったことをしてる会社さんもありますと。あとはこれも結構テクニカルな話ですが、ですね、単純にポートフォリオGP さんでポートフォリオをどんどん出資している会社の場合、単純に新しい投資をするとポートフォリオ全体の炭素排出量っていうのは増えるので、そういうなんていうんですか、ポートフォリオ全体でのカーボン排出がどれくらいかっていう計測を LP さんも求めるんではなく、もしくは GP さんも報告するんではなく、一つ一つのアセットがやっぱりどういうふうに減っていったかっていう説明ですとか管理の仕方を移行することが重要だという話がありましたと。あと最後はインセンティブですけれども、特に GP さんのところで、コンペンセーション報酬年次報酬もそうですが、キャリーですね、の総額ですとか、キャリーの中でもいろんなキャリードインテレスト総額もありますし、そのハードルレートですとかキャッチアップ条項でカーボンの削減とリンクさせていくっていう方法も取られている、GP さんもいらっしゃるということでございました。で、最後に OTPP さんのが非常に先進的なことをやられてるっていうことで、このスライドの通りのちょっと紹介がありました。はい。
So the next section is, which we can touch on briefly, is, and I'm happy to take questions about this if it's helpful, but we just wanted to share, and just this one chart, I think, with you about a paper that we did in with the World Economic Forum that gives a sense of how we can take sustainable value indicators that have traditionally been used for businesses and apply those to investors. So when we think about the opportunities and solutions for deploying gray to green capital at scale, We also turn to this question of how can investors themselves measure and communicate their commitment to sustainable value creation to their stakeholders. So we co-authored this piece of research with World Economic Forum. Asset owners that have long-term missions, so people like pension plans that are managing retirement funds, or others who have to maintain portfolios for multi-decades, are facing emerging expectations from their constituent governments, from their sponsors, or from the beneficiaries regarding sustainability. And again, we're not clear on the time frame and all those sorts of things, but if you're managing money that's going to be over decades, the climate is clearly changing. So 3 compelling rationales support institutional adoption of expanded sustainability measurement frameworks for investors. The first is transparency with their own stakeholders builds credibility and trust. The second is it addresses risks with the growing private market allocations. Private markets inherently are less visible than public markets, and many large investors are increasingly putting money into private markets. And third, especially for institutions that do have some sort of net zero commitment, or have some sort of commitment to around the sustainable development goals, they need some sort of disclosure framework to show if they're actually making progress. So this chart is simply meant to show you this 4-pillar framework. The first is about principles of governance, and it's critical to define the principles of governance around sustainability for an investor. So this definition of governance continues to evolve, but organizations are expected to define and embed their purpose at the center of their strategy, and that is vital for effective governance. The second is planet. You can see that there. You'd expect this pillar encompasses the environmental dimensions of sustainable value creation. When we say sustainable, we don't just mean environmental, we mean much more broadly. But investors who implement the recommendations of TCFD, for example, or establish other sorts of climate timeframes need to have some sort of framework to report on that. So this disclosure framework addresses governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics related to these climate risks and opportunities. The third pillar is people. And the people pillar reflects an understanding that sustainable value creation requires attention to human capital and organizational fairness. So tracking in this area includes criteria such as workforce diversity, pay equality, compensation policies, things like that. And then the fourth pillar is around prosperity. Prosperity addresses how institutional performance aligns with the stated long-term objectives. And we think this is particularly important because, again, as I said very early on, we do not think sustainability and performance are trade-offs. We think they're aligned. So ensuring that that prosperity pillar is part of the measurement is critical. So institutions evaluate and disclose their performance relative to some sort of purpose and time frame, and what we would hope to see would be performance disclosed across multiple time horizons from the longest to the shortest period so that it really can put the emphasis on that long-term period. So if we think about institutions who disclose assets that are covered by some sort of long-term mindset, longevity fees, long-term performance fees, specific long-term mindsets. That is what we would like to see here as well. So what then we'll have, is there one more page there on applying the metrics? So in closing, the research that we've presented today, this gray to green, and this investor self-assessment framework demonstrate that genuine real-world decarbonization requires both a systematic transformation of high carbon assets and rigorous measurement of investor accountability. And so these initiatives function together. GPs can implement gray to green investment strategies and can leverage the self-assessment to build credibility with our limited partners. limited partners can adopt the disclosure strategy to be better positioned to evaluate and participate in the gray to green opportunities. And so this development of gray to green investment capacity and meaningful participation by general partners and limited partners is critical to achieving this lower carbon future that climate science and social imperatives demand. So you as leaders in your organizations have an extraordinary opportunity to position your organizations in this global transition. So by embracing some of these actionable solutions we've outlined today, you can attract global capital while driving meaningful decarbonization in high carbon industries, both domestically and internationally. And FCLT Global stands ready to support that mission and collaborate with you in advancing these goals. So thank you very much for your time, and I'd look forward to any more questions people might have.
ありがとうございました。Thank you so much, Sarah, for this insightful talk. Very impressive and insightful. Let me quickly, do the last interpretation for the last few pages. ちょっと最後、時間の関係で今、全部細かくはいきませんが、簡単にこちらのですね、9ページ目以降の話、どういったお話だったか、お伝えします。どちらかというと、こちらは、LP さんですとかアセットオーナーさん向けの話で、それまではどちらかというと GP さんの話だったんですけども、その LP さんが、いろいろなステークホルダーへのコミュニケーションですとかエンゲージメントをしていく上で、こういうグレートグリーンですとかサステナビリティの話をするときに、どういうことを、世の中に共有、シェアしていくべきかっていうのの、フレームワークのご紹介がありまして、大きく4つの柱の中で、それぞれこういったことを気をつけて発信していくといいんじゃないかっていう話がありましたので、ぜひアセットオーナーさんですとか LP の方、本日もたくさんご参加されている方いらっしゃると思いますけれども、ご参考いただければと思います。で、どちらもそのアセットオーナー LP さん向けのレポートはこの右側ですね。Adapting Corporate Sustainable Value Creation っていうレポートで、ウェブサイト上で手に入りますし、左側のグレートグリーン、これどちらかというと、GP さん、ファンドマネージャーさん向けの、プレイブックみたいなものですけども、こちらも手に入るので、ご参考くださいということでした。はい。では、ちょっとこの会場5時までですので、最後10分、20分ネットワークの時間を残しつつ、もし、ご質問がありましたら、残り10分ほど、Q&A セッションもできる時間がございますが、会場の皆さん、オンラインの皆さん、どちらも、よろしければ、ぜひ、ご質問いただければと思いますが、いかがでしょうか。大丈夫そうですかね。じゃあ、ちょっと私から一つだけ、これも興味本位で質問させていただきます。So, one question from me, again, out of curiosity, but so I understand this week you are visiting Japan only for a week though, but what was the motivation behind visiting Tokyo, and what do you expect from Japanese investors?
Well, I have visited Tokyo many times in my life, and so I always look for opportunities to visit Tokyo since it's such a wonderful city. So the motivation this time is really around, from a research point of view, is that the Japanese market is at a very interesting point, which is, as I'm sure you all know, the domestic investors have been invested in this market for a long time. That's been increasingly happening, obviously. But there are many more overseas investors, foreign investors coming into the market right now. And there are real advantages of that. Obviously, the market is up a lot. There's more availability of capital. Those are all good things. But at least from my vantage point of, how do we create long-term sustainable value? The question is, how do you get the best of both worlds, right? How do you get the best of the Japanese traditions and that have worked here, and also the best of the foreign capital? You could end up with the worst of both worlds situations where the sort of long-term mindset that the Japanese companies have been known for turns into very, very short-term under the pressure of activists, and then you get somewhere that you don't want to be. So I think that this market has a huge opportunity to combine that sort of long-term mindset with the dynamism of capital markets that do exist in some other places. And so one of the reasons many reasons I'm excited to be here this week, but one of the reasons I'm excited to be here this week is to have conversations around those issues and what's working, what's not. And so we've been having conversations both with our members who have a presence here and also other groups where there are views about how this market is evolving.
Right. Thank you so much. I'm sure you are going to meet a lot of very influential high-level corporate executives this week in Japan, but hope your stay will be very fruitful. And thank you so much again for taking your time. It will be a very busy Japan visit time. So please give her last minute of a big round of applause. Then thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
ありがとうございました。ではこちらで一旦オンラインの方は終了させていただきまして、残りは会場で少しネットワーキングの時間にさせていただければと思います。